Well, it's with great pleasure that I'm introducing Paul Ashwin. Paul is Professor of Higher Education at Lancaster and is a very active and important member of the CG team. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce Paul and look forward to hearing his keynote. Thank you, Paul.
Thanks, Claire. Okay, so this morning we had Mike's really engaging presentation about the governance of universities. Then we had Marek talk to us in her keynote session about research and its global position in higher education. And what we're going to focus on now, or what I'm going to focus on now, is the educational role of universities. And it's important in understanding the argument I'm going to make, that I'm making this argument in relation to universities as educational institutions. So, for example, I'll probably make a few asides about rankings. When I do that, I'm talking about rankings that tell us that they are communicating something about educational quality. I am not commenting on research rankings, just to make that clear. Okay, so to give you a sense of the argument of this presentation, the argument is that public debates over the value of an undergraduate education have been dominated by oversimplified accounts of the educational perspective. That when we think about what higher education gives to students, we think about it in ways that are far too simple, and that this makes us lose sight of the power of that education, and it distorts our understanding of quality and what a high quality undergraduate education looks like. And so my argument that I'll make through this presentation is that we need to refocus our attention on these educational purposes if we're going to understand the transformational nature of an undergraduate education. Now, the reason that there's a reference to David Watson there is that I think about this project as a Watsonian project, as something that is informed by the spirit that David Watson gave in thinking about higher education. And my understanding of that spirit is that David was a passionate advocate for higher education. He believed in the strength and power of higher education, but equally, he was demanding of those of us in higher education to build convincing arguments. It wasn't enough to just mark our own homework and say, oh, well, that's convincing. We actually have to convince others. We actually have to engage with others and make arguments that work. And so, for me, that's what I'm trying to do. And that fits with the spirit of the overall theme for this conference about challenging higher education. A sense that we might be in challenging environments, but also we need to challenge ourselves. You know, so this really is a conversation with higher education. I'm deliberately talking to higher education, and I hope those of you in the room who aren't in that role will excuse this, but also in the later discussion, bringing other points that might help to develop our understanding further. So this talk is underpinned by a series of projects. The first of all was a project that I was involved in with Monica McLean from Nottingham and Andrew Abbas, who's now at the University of Bath, where we tracked sociology students in 4 universities through the 3 years of their degrees and looked at the way in which they experienced those programs. And we had 2 sociology degrees that were always at the top of league tables for sociology and 2 sociology degrees that were always at the bottom of league tables for sociology, and we did some thinking about the quality. So that partly informs, I'm going to draw on some data from that project. The second thing that's informed this is a book, an internationally collaboratively authored book that has about 10 authors, I think, one of whom's in the room, Kelly Coate, where it's a book for teachers in higher education about development teaching, and that also informs some of the arguments I'm going to make. And then there's 2 CG projects that I've been involved in that also play into this argument. First of all, a networking project that we had in South Africa that involved UK and South African researchers and some international researchers really looking at existing research, not doing any new data generation, but looking about what do we know about how South African undergraduate education leads to the public good. How does access, students' experiences of higher education and graduate outcomes make a contribution to students personally, but also to South African society? And South Africa's a really interesting case because within the South African constitution, higher education is expected to transform society because of the apartheid past. And given the levels of inequality in South Africa as well, it gives arguments about higher education and the nature of an undergraduate education a different kind of resonance than it has in the UK. And then the final project is a project that's called Understanding Knowledge and Student Agency, where we're taking chemistry and chemical engineering degrees to universities in England, 2 universities in South Africa, and 2 universities in the United States, and we're tracking students through the 3 or 4 years of our degree. I say we, that's a group of us from Lancaster, including Yanya, who's here, a group in the United States, led by Jenny Case, and a group in South Africa, led by Renee Smith and Max Blackie. So we're tracking students through their degrees and trying to understand. And the motivation for that project, which I'll come on and talk a little bit about, was that a lot of this kind of research is done in subjects where the response is, that's sociology, Paul. You know, sociology, what would you expect? So for me, there was a motivation to take a different kind of subject and also to look at it internationally and to try and think about how these things play out internationally. Now, there's a central question that comes to me from all of these projects, which is how do we develop a vision of an inclusive, transformational higher education system, and as I said, I mean an educational system, rather than an elitist reproductive one. What I think happens is that whenever you have elite education, it is reproductive education. What happens an awful lot is that we mistake privilege for ability. We do this with our institutions, we do this with our students, we might even do this with our politicians. That actually the things we think are ability are actually markers of privilege. In Morag Henderson's really interesting session on First in the Family, for me there was further evidence of how that might play out. And our thinking about higher education in the UK and undergraduate education in the UK is so dominated by debates about Oxford and Cambridge. And again, this for me is an illustration of how we mistake prestige for quality. I'm not saying they might not, you know, that clearly there are situations where you do have prestige and quality together, but there are also other situations where you don't have quality, but you have an awful lot of prestige. So, what are these oversimplified tales of narratives of education that I'm talking about? So, the major one that I'm going to focus on is the generic skills version of an undergraduate education. So, this takes the form of the key purpose of higher education is to provide the next generation of professionals. We can best do this by helping students to develop generic competences that are valued by employers and society, and then this will lead our students to be individually prosperous and will lead to economic development. And in lots of ways, this fits very strongly with the English marketized version of higher education that Mike spoke to about earlier, but these discourses aren't just in the UK. If you go to Norway, if you go to the Netherlands, if you go to Australia, the same arguments are being made, that it's no longer enough to think about disciplinary or professional knowledge. We need to move beyond that to think about generic skills. And I think this is a great mistake. There's 2 aspects of the mistake I'm going to focus on. The first aspect is, as I've said, that it simplifies what that education involves. If we see the notion of doing a degree as getting some generic skills and then going out to employment, that impoverished view of an education causes all kinds of problems. But it's also that if what you want is generic skills, why would you ask universities to do that? There's plenty of other people who are in the business of generic skills who might be far better placed to develop them. And also, there's limited evidence that actually universities are any good at developing these generic skills. So the Aram and Roxa study, Academically Adrift, that caused big waves in the US, was based on the CLA, which is a generic skills assessment. So their argument that students seem to learn very little in college was based on data that when you look at CLA scores, they didn't change. So a view of developing generic skills. So one of the problems with that is that it opens higher education up to criticism. If we say, as many universities have said, oh yeah, we can do employability, give us the money, come on, and then we don't, that undermines what we're trying to do as higher education. And one of the views that can take hold when the evidence suggests that maybe we're not as good at developing generic skills as we think we are as universities is the signalling view of higher education. The view that actually all higher education is a signal to employers that this person's worth a look. And if they go to a more prestigious university, then they're even more worth a look. Come on, this is the right person. But what happens as this argument meets mass higher education is you get plenty of arguments saying, well, more and more people are going to university, but because it's only about signalling, what they're learning is irrelevant, and so why are we paying all this money for higher education if it's simply about signalling and that's causing inflation within the system? And so you start to get an undermining of a commitment to higher education because actually it's just about sorting. But, as I've said, because that sorting relies a lot on privilege rather than ability, then you can see that this starts to reinforce notions of elite reproductive higher education. And so it gets strongly linked to global rankings in terms of education and institutional prestige. They come to the fore. That's what's important. You know, in Morag's presentation, and Morag wasn't arguing for this, but one of the examples she gave was suboptimal choices. If you don't go to the best university you could go to in the rankings, you've made a suboptimal choice. That gives us a sense of what we think is important. You must go to, you know, the whole Sutton Trust agenda is not enough students go to Russell Group universities. Well, what if those universities don't cater for those students? You know, is that something you want to base your life missions on? You'll probably realise that my answer is no, but you can make your own answer. So this signalling view starts to really undermine a commitment to higher education as an educational enterprise. And the Kaplan book, which is called Against Education, he's based in America. And his view is that basically we are wasting money providing any government subsidies for higher education. And he says, you know, this case is flimsy because actually students can get any knowledge they need, well, not students, people can get any knowledge they need off the internet. You know, there's nothing special about higher education knowledge, it's just generic skills. So if you want it, you can just get it off the internet. He also makes the claim that the fact that, that people who are interested in learning don't just turn up to universities where they're not enrolled to go to classes shows that all they care about is diplomas. Because, you know, they could easily get in if they wanted to. So if they were really interested in learning, then there'd be no need for them to enroll. They could just turn up. And then he further argues that the fact that actually what people use the internet for is not ideas and culture, this shows that it's not about poverty or inconvenience or inequality, it's simply about apathy. Actually, people aren't interested in education. Now, I find this book particularly egregious, which is why I've given it a bit of time, but I think the point I'm trying to make here is that when you oversimplify the educational process of higher education, you give these arguments much more room. If what we do educationally as universities is incredibly simple, then actually going to university simply being about sending a signal can gain more dominance. And this oversimplification also matters because it impacts on the way in which we think about quality, and in particular, how we measure quality. So the idea that labour market outcomes are one of the best ways, certainly in the Teaching Excellence Framework, they're getting an increasing profile, an increasing weighting as a way of measuring the quality of education, despite the fact that we know that how well students do in the labour market is structured by institutional prestige and by the background of the students. You know, we know this is what happens. And so when we focus on labour market outcomes, we again help to reinforce a view that actually it's about elite education, but because elite institutions' access is stratified, then it also becomes about reproductive education. And as an aside, you know, one of the things that really helps me to think about this is thinking about the notion of graduate premiums in relation to the South African higher education system. Because the government like to talk about graduate premiums as if they're a measure of what higher education does. The higher the difference between what a graduate earns compared to a non-graduate earns, the higher the quality of higher education. It's complete nonsense. Graduate premiums are a measure of inequality. So in the highest graduate premiums in the world are for chemical engineering in South Africa, because South Africa is one of the most unequal countries in the world. You know, and actually, wouldn't you want a society where whether you've done a degree or not does not have a huge impact on how much you earn? But again, the logic we get into with these simplified versions of what the educational purposes of universities is, allows these arguments just to become an automatic way of thinking. Well, of course graduate premiums are good. Why would anyone think they're bad? Well, you think they're bad because actually they're a measure of inequality rather than quality. So how might we respond to the generic skills view in an educational way? Well, first of all, the important thing is just to take apart the notion of generic competences. So what generic competencies do is they make the error that just because you can describe something generically, that does not mean that what's going on in that situation is meaningfully generic. If we wanted to describe what's going on in this room, we could describe it in as many ways as we had the imagination to do so. You know, so if we came up with 50 descriptions of what was going on in this room, would that mean there were 50 different things going on? No. There's simply 50 different descriptions. And this is really what goes on with generic skills. They're ways of describing. So, and also, just because you can describe something in terms of communication skills, for example, it doesn't mean that what's going on in that situation is really about communication skills. It might be about something else. And once you start to think about particular examples of particular generic skills, you realise that they're complete nonsense when taken away from the context of the knowledge that relates to them. So, for example, communication skills. As you can see, I've got fantastic communication skills. So because I've got such good communication skills in English, my communication skills in Chinese must be brilliant. Oh, no, they're not. No, I'm a monolinguist, embarrassingly enough, so I don't have good, so only in English. Oh, okay. But that's language. I've played a trick there. So, what about problem solving? If I can solve a problem as a chemist, then I can solve a problem as a sociologist. Well, no, it's just nonsense. Because unless you have the knowledge to make sense of what's going on in the situation, to read the situation in a particular kind of ways, those generic skills aren't doing anything useful for you. Note that I'm not saying there aren't generic skills. There might be arguments for them. I'm saying that educationally, thinking about what we do as universities in terms of generic skills does not give us an educational case for the importance of universities. So, to give an example from a student from the sociology project, who we gave the pseudonym Esther to, she says, there's no destination with this discipline, there's always something further, and there's no point where you can stop and say, I understood, I'm a sociologist. The thing is, sociology makes you aware of every decision you make, how that would impact on my life, and how it could impact on someone else's. And it makes the decision harder to make. Now, if someone wants to describe that in terms of generic skills, you could. But I would argue passionately that's not what's going on there. This is about the student's identity coming into relationship to knowledge and changing the way in which she sees and engages with the world. And what we found in the survey for the project is that actually the more students engage with sociological knowledge, the greater their sense of social confidence, the greater their intention to change themselves, the greater their development of the more academic and employability skills they said they develop, and countered to consumerist rationales, the more satisfied they were with their course. Now, clearly, there's always questions of causation and which way things go around. But I would say that this sense that actually the knowledge is playing a crucial role here. The knowledge is giving meaning to the skills. The knowledge is helping the student to think about themselves differently. And actually the levels of engagement with knowledge cut across the traditional hierarchies of our four institutions. So it wasn't that the more privileged institutions had higher levels of engagement with academic knowledge. But as I've said, that's chemistry. That's not chemistry, is it? It's sociology. That's what we'd expect for sociology. But actually, if you look across a range of subject areas, you find a similar way in which students come into relationship to knowledge. So in mathematics, there's a whole range of international studies showing how students, sometimes see maths, well, it's just numbers, isn't it? It's just what you do with numbers. And then that shifts over time to seeing maths in terms of models and modelling the world, to then seeing mathematics in terms of an approach to life. Similarly, in accountancy, a professional subject, a sense of accountancy being routine, to actually accountancy being something meaningful, to accountancy being a form of moral work. And I won't go through all of them, but what you have is a sense of students initially seeing their subject or their profession in terms of a particular kind of thing, to then seeing it in terms of a structured body of knowledge. And then in some cases, with the inclusive account, moving beyond that structure to think about what it tells them about themselves. And I would argue this is what higher education does. This is what is higher about higher education. It's about coming into contact with an organised body of knowledge and thinking about what that says about who you are and what the world is. Now, again, I'm sure someone could describe that in terms of generic skills, but I don't think it is about generic skills. That's not what's at stake in that process. And just to give a quote from one of the chemistry students from the project, CGHE project, he says, I'll observe something which someone who doesn't do chemistry, they'll just see it for what it is. But then, in my mind, I just start thinking about the theory behind why that's working. Sometimes the science element kind of goes off in my brain, and I start analysing things in that kind of way, other than just seeing it for the things for what it is. I feel like in science, that's the way we move forward. Because, science, it's great to know, but it's not purely for the benefit of knowledge. We want knowledge, but then we want to see how we can use that knowledge and how we can apply it and improve things. So again, clearly I've chosen quotations that suit my case. This isn't a full analysis of that data. But again, an example in chemistry of how this knowledge is relating to students' sense of who they are and what they can do in the world. So my argument is that the transformative power of higher education for students lies in these relationships between students, knowledge, and the world. And sometimes that's about knowledge enabling students to see the world differently. Sometimes it's about the knowledge enabling students to see themselves differently. But sometimes it's not necessarily about the knowledge. Sometimes it's just the experience of being at university actually changing students' view of the world. So it doesn't have to be about knowledge, but my argument is what's special about universities and higher education is that structured body of knowledge. That's the thing that universities have that other places in societies don't have in the same way. So my argument for the educational purpose of university is that teaching is about designing ways in which particular students can develop an understanding of particular bodies of disciplinary or professional knowledge. Okay, so it's about how students come in relation to that knowledge, and it changes their sense of who they are, what they can do in the world, and enables them to make things happen. But it's really important to be clear, This isn't always what universities do. It doesn't always happen. And what we found in the sociology project is that one of the key things was students understanding going to university as an educational endeavour, understanding it as something in which they would be changed. Now, it's really important to be clear that we had students who, in their first year, saw going to university as about getting a good job. It wasn't that set limits on whether or not they changed. It was simply whether they understood that going to university was an education. And again, part of this argument is that when universities say to students, come to us, you'll increase your salary, in fact, we're sending out the wrong message about what higher education does and what it involves as an endeavour. And also what you need to do in order to benefit from it. So, what transforming university teaching looks like, to get to the title of my slide late in the piece, is it's about well-designed degree programs that are both knowledge-centred and student-centred. It's about designing curricula that think about the relationship between who students are, why the knowledge is powerful, and what that knowledge will enable students to do. Now, it's really important here to understand that part of this is really understanding who our students are. Actually being clear about who are the students who are studying with us on this programme. Not who are the ideal students we wish we had. Oh, because that's always the argument, isn't it? Employers always say, well, it's the universities. They're not what they used to be. And the universities say, well, it's the secondary schools. They're just rubbish these days. And the secondary schools say, well, yeah, it'll be all right, but those primary schools, they're a bit rubbish. And the primary schools blame the nurseries, and the nurseries blame the parents, and the parents blame the students. This has been ever thus. If you look at accounts of higher education, from the time that higher education first existed, students have never been what they were. That loss of innocence narrative is one of the stable things about universities. People always think students weren't as good as they were, basically. And that's because they overestimate how good they are and underestimate how good their students are. So this is about thinking about who your students are. Why are you teaching them this? If you're doing a degree and you're teaching a subject and you don't know why it's being taught, why are you wasting your time and the students' time in teaching it? I always feel that if I'm teaching students and they stop me and say, Paul, why are we doing this? If I can't answer that, then I shouldn't be teaching it in the first place. But also, who will that knowledge enable them to become in the future? Yes, in terms of employability. Clearly, employability, getting a job, is as important for our students as it is for us. But it's not all there is in the world. It's not all of what their lives are about. So we need to have a sense about how they contribute to society, how they'll build their lives. And it's really important to recognise this is a really hard thing to do. It's not easy. It's an intellectual activity. It's the kind of thing we should be doing as academics, thinking about why we're teaching this. Not designing courses saying, well, that's Bob's module. Bob always teaches that. Better leave it in. But actually, collectively, thinking about the body of knowledge and what it can do, and from there, trying to work out what's your best bet for the ways in which students will benefit. So having a programme that is not a collection of modules, having a programme that has a design behind it. So this isn't any form of higher education. This is a particular form of higher education. And for this to happen, curricula need to change. One of the things that's really depressing about debates around gaining access to Oxbridge is we yet again now have the idea, what we need is an access programme. If we give these bright but poor students an access programme, then they'll get up to speed and then we don't need to change the curriculum. It's exactly what they tried in South Africa post-apartheid. It does not work. We know it does not work. What you actually have to do is to change the curriculum. And this is not dumbing down. In the universities that we had in the sociology studies, the university where the students produced the best sociology in the end was one that we gave the pseudonym diversity to, a metropolitan post-92 mass university, in which they thought carefully about who their students were, they thought about how to bring them into relation to sociology, and by the end, the sociology they produced was as good, if not better, than students in the institutions we gave the pseudonyms Prestige and Selective to. So it's simply about thinking about the educational task. Who is my student? What is this knowledge? And how can I work out ways of bringing those things together and creating a change? And this way of thinking about university teaching then plays in to how we think about measurement. So the question isn't about what salaries do students earn, what percentage are employable. It's about how was a course designed, how was evidence used in order to inform this course, how successful was the program in actually bringing students in relationship to that knowledge. And again, that it's important to be clear that that kind of discussion about knowledge and making that somehow publicly available is a contentious thing that needs working through. You know, clearly that presents the opportunity of interference in academic freedom. But if we can't explain to students why we're educating them in the way we're educating them, then we're not educators. Now, some people in universities would be very happy to say, no, I'm not an educator, I'm a lecturer, I'm not a teacher. You know, there used to be all those letters in the Times Higher with amusing regularity about that. But if we're engaged in a situation where the majority of young people are going to university, then we have to be able to educationally explain what we're about and why we're of benefit. So, as I hope I've made clear, this argument is that actually, if we're going to sustain higher education, if we're going to have a higher education that is about bringing students in relationship to powerful knowledge, that is about bringing all students into relationship to powerful knowledge, that isn't about, well, which of the elite institutions, they're the ones that we really need to think about. We need to think about a system of education. We need to think about how, as academics, how as institutional leaders, we make a contribution to thinking about the educational process, how we develop arguments for the power of education and undergraduate education that are clear about why this knowledge is important and who it allows students to become in the future. And I think this is something that universities need to do. Universities need to be far more able to talk about what is powerful about their education. To my mind, what they've done so far is you have basically a mixture between some text about the widening participation, angle and why that's really good, some text about these are the collection of things you can do, and then some text about, and this is how much people earn. None of that describes education. None of that gives an account of why higher education is educationally powerful. And as I say, this is something that's challenging and difficult. And it's an intellectual process that actually we need to engage with. But if we don't engage with it, then we'll end up supporting these oversimplified views of education that actually undermine the educational process of universities, and will continue to support a system that is essentially reproductive and elitist rather than a system that can transform society and give many more people access to a powerful education. So that's my slight rant, slight presentation. I look forward to your questions.
Well, that was great, Paul, and if any of us needed a lecture on what a higher education looks like, certainly that was it. Okay, the floor is open to everybody. So, Tristan? Okay, please go ahead. Yeah.
Thanks, Paul. That was really made me think a lot, and I fully buy your argument about the oversimplification, the need for universities to be able to talk about what's powerful and what they do, and also this kind of delinking between prestige and quality. So the queries I've got a couple of linked questions are around this idea of the generic. And the first is that there seem to be two things going on. There's the generic and the specific, or the disciplinary, on the one hand, and then there's the skills as opposed to knowledge. And you were talking about both of those. And is it that there's a necessary connection between them, or can they, can they be independent of one another to some degree? So that was one thing. And the second is around, if we move away from the generic, do we necessarily go towards the traditional Western disciplines? Or is there any room in that for a recreation of those, or perhaps a challenging from a different kind of epistemology to what those disciplines might be?
Thanks, Tristan. That's a great question. So in terms of whether it's generic or specific, that's not something I can answer for every degree program that's offered. For me, that is about the people teaching and leading those programs, sitting down and saying, what's powerful about what we do? Now, I can imagine professional areas where they'd say, no, it is generic. This is what it is. But my point is that not everything's generic. And so what people need to do, who have the expertise in those subject areas, is to work through that process. In terms of whether this is Western disciplines, clearly, decolonial arguments about the curriculum play into this. This sense of the arguments I'm making about powerful knowledge, you can read as saying, oh, okay, so you're pushing a Western curriculum. I think my response has slightly different elements to it. So first of all, we need to think about who our students are and how we make that knowledge accessible to them. But we also need to accept that we have particular kinds of expertise. And the reason students want higher education is because of that expertise. So what we teach and what we introduce students to needs to be somehow defined by our expertise. That doesn't mean the curriculum can't change, but we do need to recognise that there's no point in us teaching a curriculum that we don't feel expert in, but somehow relates to another kind of agenda. If we're not expert, then we should be out of the way, allowing someone else to offer that education. So and clearly, those arguments in relation to literature, to sociology, I can immediately see how they gain purchase. In relation to chemistry, what would a decolonial chemistry look like? I don't know. Doesn't mean there isn't one, but it means that we have to respect the knowledge that's been produced. And also the other thing is that a lot of that knowledge isn't Western in the first place. The origins of mathematics aren't in the West. So there's all kinds of oversimplifications that play into this. But in the end, if we're offering someone an education, it needs to be based on our expertise, it needs to be carefully planned, and it needs to be informed by evidence about how our students are learning, what they're saying to us, and how well that design's working, rather than based on, well, week one, whatever.
Okay, Nick.
Yeah, thanks very much. It was a really interesting presentation, a good way to end the day, very thought-provoking. I think I agreed with pretty much everything you said. But then I thought, if you were a sixth form teacher at a pretty academic school with a pretty academic bunch of kids, would your approach be so different? Because if I understood you correctly, you were saying a lot of these things were defining features of higher education. And I wonder if they're actually just defining features of various forms of education. I wonder if it really is a defining feature always of higher education.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I guess my response would be that it's a necessary condition for higher education. If it's not about bringing people in relation to structured bodies of knowledge, then to me that's not higher education. And I am fully aware in saying that there are some things that are currently positioned as higher education that aren't. And for me, then that's about having a wider discussion about why they will be or why they won't be. But certainly that question about is it just education, I think is a really good question. And I suppose part of what I was doing was really rhetorical in terms of trying to make with force this sense about if we call it higher, what's higher about it? And I do think the higher nature of higher education lies in the way in which we deal with knowledge, but I completely accept there are places that wouldn't position themselves in that way that do a similar kind of thing. But it's, it's sort of drawing on an old argument about universities as stewards of knowledge. And really, that for me is an underpinning belief for me in making this argument, is that we have to recognise as social institutions, that's the key thing universities do. And an awful lot of the things universities currently do seem to take us away from that core focus, and that has unintended consequences that actually devalue the important things we're trying to do.
Hi, thank you very much. Thank you for your elegant and interesting presentation. But I have a question. One, we always said education reform is always at the gate of the classroom. So how and what can teacher, that means the professors and the lecturers can benefit from this transforming university teaching? Thank you.
Okay, my sense is that they do. Sorry, did you?
I mean, we always ask teachers to do so many things, but maybe the evaluation of teachers' work or professors' work, not just the teaching, maybe research and other things according to the higher education anchor. So maybe the teacher, they have a lot of some things to do. For example, professors must pay more attention, more emphasis on their research work or other things. So you just, we all know that the teaching is very important, but how and what can we benefit from this? Thank you.
Okay, so I do think that there's a benefit from this, which is we did some work at Lancaster drawing on these ideas in the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, and with each course team we said, who will your students become by engaging with your degree? And actually this turned into a really interesting intellectual discussion. So sociology department at Lancaster, which is a globally renowned department, had a big discussion, and for them it was about producing public sociologists. So actually engaging these questions, these educational questions, actually can be a far more intellectual engaging activity than doing a course on teaching large classes. For me, if we put curriculum design at the centre of educational development, if we spend our time thinking about how do we make these curricula as effective as we can, and how do we have collective discussions with academics, with learning technologists, with academic developers, with a range of people to try and come up with the best design, that's the best way of developing teaching. So for me, and the other thing is that then in thinking about how you make knowledge accessible to other people is very often a key way of developing insights into your own research. When you have to think about how does this look from all these different angles? How can I find a way into this for my students? Very often that links to something you're thinking about in your research. But, in the end, my response would be that if we're saying universities are educational institutions, then we have to take the education seriously.
Hi, Emily Henderson from the University of Warwick. Thanks very much, Paul. I feel very sort of galvanised by this, but I also felt, I don't know if I should be sitting here and listening to this. Is this meant to be galvanising me? Is it meant to be galvanising heads of department who are put in kind of technocratic managerial positions, asking for cost cuttings and forgetting about being a visionary leader? Is it about all the new positions that have opened up in universities around the TEF, so that we end up with kind of people who don't have an education background, who are creating the very discourses that you're evoking here about generic skills, about employability? I feel like actually quite often it's out of our hands, the image of the university. We have these new professionals that are proliferating, with absolutely no education background, who are selling higher education back to the UK public in certain ways. I wonder if they should be listening to your talk. What do you say about this new class of educational professionals, I guess is what I want to know. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily. Well, clearly I think everyone should be listening to me, but you know, that's just what I'm like. And I'm sure everyone else as well. But I mean, I think for me this argument is about, as higher education as a collective, including these new professionals, taking responsibility for the education we offer. So, you know, my experience of those new professionals is they are trying to do a difficult job to the best of their ability. So what we want to have is we want to involve them in dialogue about how we're trying to make knowledge accessible and how that plays into the task they've got. And the other underlying thing for this argument is that the academic workforce is the most highly educated workforce in the world. And if we sit around saying, look at all the things that have been done to us, or I was born 20 years too late. If only I was a professor 20 years ago, my life would have been brilliant. If we don't make the best of the circumstances we're in and take responsibility for doing what we can to try and make education accessible, then we've got no one but ourselves to blame. It doesn't mean we'll be successful. It doesn't mean it will work. But being an academic is a privilege. And with that privilege comes a responsibility to actually argue for the kinds of education you think are important. And to recognise that other people have other arguments, that your arguments don't always win. But that sense of argument, contestation, coming to some form of compromise is what higher education's about. And if we don't do it, if we say, oh, well, there's money for the employability agenda, so we'll just write it in those terms, then we don't recognise that with that comes a huge cost. And actually, we need to recognise that cost, and when we can, reject it and say, no, that's not what we do. What we're trying to do here. We're trying to do something different.
Hi, I'm Jisho. I'm a PhD candidate at Aoi, and I really like your presentation. And I think we do need someone to be so critical about the current situation now. But still, I want to raise a boring and practical issue about my concern. Because of my background, I'm trying to listen to your research from a working class student's perspective. So it's like, is it practical to achieve that? Because Claire was at another seminar 2 weeks before. It's about the risk after they graduate and trying to look for a job. I mean, for the middle class students, of course, they can try to understand the world and themselves and the dream and the fancy stuff. But for the, but for the working class students who want to find a secure job, they want the stability. So I mean, considering this existing inequality in our society, the entrepreneur discourse all around us, and also this, this the neoliberal age that we are in, how powerful you think this transforming teaching would break the circle of reproduction and inequality? And also, to me, it sounds very middle class. And do you think what you are proposing here is like class-based or something? Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, so just to answer that in a roundabout way, a lot of this is informed by my professional trajectory. So I worked for 7 years in further education in the East End of London, setting up peer learning schemes where students supported each other, and that turned into my PhD. And from there, I got a postdoc position at the University of Oxford, researching students' learning. So I went from an FE college that was 73% ethnic minorities, that was in the poorest borough in the country at that time, to the University of Oxford. And what I found was that at Oxford, there are a few people who are off the scale, just to make, you'd sit in a room and you'll be like, oh, but very few. The rest of them were about as clever as the people I worked with and the students I worked with in FE at Newham. The difference was how quickly they tell you they were clever and their sense of entitlement. So I think this view about the importance of knowledge, you could position it as middle class. One of the dangers of the argument I'm making is because I'm saying you need to think about who your students are and you have elite institutions that have very different kinds of students than more mass institutions, then you might end up with very different kinds of curricula. That would be problematic. That would be an unintended consequence. But I do think we need to think about how we're making knowledge available. We need to give, most people who are interested in something and we can show them the relevance, my belief is they have the ability to benefit from a higher education. And my argument isn't that this will end inequality. My argument is that for a very small moment, in a very small way, this and plenty of other things might disrupt inequality for a moment. But in the end, the experience is that inequality always reasserts. People want the best for their children, and if you're richer and you have more power, you're in a better position to do the best for your children than someone who isn't. So that is something that is fundamentally at the heart of inequality. It's not an intentional or not very often an intentional movement for inequality, but it's that sense of pushing individual interests. So for me, finding ways of understanding that knowledge is collective, knowledge is something we hold together, and trying to think collectively about an education system rather than individual institutions might offer a way of doing something. But it will be limited, it will work for a while, and then we need to find something else, because we know this is how educational ideas work. They have a power for a few years, and then you need something else. Then you need other voices. Then you need other people to come in and change things. So I don't think there's an agenda here for changing society. There's an agenda here for us to think for the moment what we can do educationally that might offer more people access to knowledge that we think is really important.
The front, yeah, I know. No, this beforehand.
Thank you, Paul, for your so empowering and insightful president. And as far as I know, the higher education originated from the mechanism of industrial mass production. So the current higher education operates in this way to generate graduates to cater for the needs of our society. And in your presentation, you emphasized again and again about one word. I think this is what I can take away from your presentation, is about the transforming. Transform the current higher education system, because it was oversimplified. And so I'm really wondering about your point about the future of the higher education, because the transforming, I think it means about the revolutionize. It's not just about based on the current mechanism, based on the current oversimplified course, just change a little, step by step. So what's your point about the future of higher education? It's just based on the current mechanism, changed a little, or just we will take a completely new path in the future?
Okay, thank you. So I would say that the part of that is answered by collectively people thinking about what they're trying to do educationally. History would suggest that things change in some ways dramatically, in other ways very little at all. And I guess the other thing that underpins what my view of higher education in the world is, if things look really good, then they're likely to change and become more problematic. If things look really bad, they're likely to change and become slightly better. So that kind of sense of things are never as bad as they look and they're never as good as they look would inform my answer to that. In the end, being a human in the world is a struggle. As people get richer, they don't get hugely happier, they struggle with the human condition. So my sense is that the human condition is a struggle, but what we need to do is try and make that struggle as fair as it's in our power to do. So I don't think that's going to lead to, changes in that way won't lead to huge changes, but if we think knowledge is important, if we think it's powerful, then we have a responsibility to share that with as many people who are interested.
Okay. Great. And the final question, Graham.
Hi, Paul. The teaching excellence framework in this country was mentioned, and you also said something after that about not worrying too much about having things done to us. And I wanted to follow up on that a little bit. I think you and I would probably agree that the teaching excellence framework is an example of a policy on teaching and learning that is very much neither student-centred nor knowledge-centred. But that doesn't necessarily mean that such policies can't exist. So I guess my question is, what kinds of policies should governments, in your view, institute to help enable this approach? And do any governments in the world currently impress you in relation to learning and teaching specifically?
Does Simon need to speak now? So I should clarify. I didn't say we shouldn't worry about having things done to us. Clearly, we should contest when things are done to us. What we shouldn't do is sit around and talk about how the situation is the fault of everything that's done to us without taking any responsibility for the role that we've played in creating that situation, and in many cases benefiting from that situation. So in terms of what policies would do, really the TEF is about measuring the quality of education and providing students with information about where good higher education is available. I don't have an issue with either of those things, particularly when students are paying so much for their education. But what I think you need is actually valid measures that tell you about the quality of that education. So having a course that can tell you why it's designed in the way it is, how its knowledge is powerful, what students can become afterwards, to me provides students with far more useful information about what that course can do than salary information that might be 12 years out of date by the time they graduate. So I don't have any issue with having measurement that is done by an organising body, whether that's government or someone else. And I think if you look at the way in which Norway's approach to teaching excellence, there are some really interesting things there. But all of these things are really difficult. What I'm not trying to say is this is a simple answer, buy the Ashwin and you'll be right for 5 years. I'm saying this is a struggle and something that we need to work with. But at the moment, because discussions are so focused around generic skills, employabilities, and salaries, we're not having an educational conversation about the large number of people who are coming through universities. And we need to see part of our role as to be involved in a collective conversation about what we're doing educationally.
Colleagues, we've reached the end of our time, and it's magnificent that we've held a significant number of people here after going over time because of the break for the fire alarm. I think the fire alarm probably freshened us up by taking us outside. It was a bit tough on Mark, though, in the middle of her keynote. I want to say what wonderful keynotes we had and how thoroughly agreeable they were, in the sense of we can agree with them rather than that they didn't challenge us. That was great, Paul, and I think that it resonated around the room. We could have had long further discussion of the themes that Paul explored, but we will have further discussion of those themes. Your participation in the conference was great. All the sessions that I attended, lots of questions, lots of good points, lots of useful additional ideas about the research emerging, and it just shows what a valuable thing a good conference is. We don't have enough of them. We have one a year. We've got one more in this sequence of the centre, the first 5 years, next year, which will be in some ways summative, I think, and pulling a lot of research findings together and putting different research projects against each other. But we think that we'll probably have funding for a continuation of the centre, at least at half scale, for another 3 years under the ESRC's current arrangements. There are a lot of hurdles to jump to get us to that point, but we're not competing for that funding, and so we should be able to do it. We also hope to have a full centre, again, with a substantially renovated program and new ideas, and that bit will be going in a year's time. I mention that because one of the issues that arises at this point of the conference is how can you participate further in the centre, apart from obviously attending seminars and other events and taking part in those in the discussion. And one way I think is that is putting forward ideas. And normally with the fixed set of projects that we have, there's not much scope for you to suggest substantial new lines of research that we could get involved in. And we're not a funding body with a pot of money to distribute. But when we're at the point where we're thinking about a new centre, a new 5-year full-funded program, there is an opportunity, I think, to get involved in thinking about good ideas. But, I mean, if you want to go down that track, thinking of good areas that we could be working on, you could be working on with us, then I'd say think about others that you could work with. Don't put individual proposals forward, put proposals forward with a group of people, and perhaps try and relate them to the existing emphases, themes, projects that we are currently running, because that gives you some idea of capacity. I'm not opening a door broadly and saying anyone with a good idea is going to be part of the new centre. It's not that easy, unfortunately, but I do want to make it possible for good ideas to come forward and for our community to broaden to the extent that we can. I want to sincerely thank the speakers throughout today and the chairs, including Claire in this last session. Thank you very much. Tristan, who was interrupted, but managed it all very well, I thought. And a special thanks to Catherine Buckle, who has carried this conference administratively, has been the person with the microphone, who's been walking around, but that is, you know, 0.5% of what she's done even today and in the last few weeks. We've completely depended on her, we've taken her for granted, and she's leaving us, unfortunately, to a new job in a week or so's time. So, but, you know, just, Catherine, your 6 months of a CGHE. Also, thanks to Trevor Trehan, who's seized the communications job with enthusiasm, and to Ellie Gaspar, who's our other administrator who's here as well. Thank you all, and thank you to the Institute of Education for, again, you know, what a valuable facility Jeffrey Hall is, what a valuable place the IOE is when you've got a large conference and you need to bring people together, such a good location, and such excellent support for CG at IOE. So thank you very much. Thank you, IOE. And see you all next year.
Is that right? Oh, thank you. Oh.